All right, hey, Eric Byler here at the ACT to End Racism rally in Washington, D.C., honoring Martin Luther King on the 50th anniversary of his death. You were the keynote speaker. Tell us a summary of what your message was today.
What I wanted to share with everyone today is that we are in an age and a stage where we cannot be silent about racism anymore, that if we see it, we have to say something about it, and there are some things that are just not okay.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, actually Bishop Barber now, he's in Memphis today. He once said to me something that was really jarring. He said the civil rights movement didn't end, it was murdered. And yet I also heard a lot of people saying the civil rights movement continues today. Can you square that?
Well, you know, I didn't hear the whole context of his speech about whether it was murdered. Dr. King was murdered. But the fight for freedom still lives on. It may live on in a different way, it may come up in different factions, but it still lives on. And that's why you have thousands of people who came to the mall today. When the wind came, they stayed. When the rain came, they stayed.
What King understood powerfully is that at the heart of being Christian is an understanding of the Imago Dei, the image of God in all of humanity. I cannot be a Christian and not advocate for equality regardless of race, ethnicity, creed, sexual orientation. That is a part of who we are as Christians. And when Martin Luther King spoke about silence being betrayal, he was primarily speaking to Christians who understood that there's something wrong with racism. Not just the cross burnings, not just the dogs attacking in the streets, not just the fire hoses that were injuring persons, but also the mistreatment of students in classrooms, the allocation of resources disproportionately away from people of color.
I think a lot of Americans who aren't religious, assumptions that they make about churches, at least white churches, is that their goals are not aligned with yours. And I know there are tons of white churches that were represented here today, but so much of the focus right now is on the white churches who will apologize for the behavior of Donald Trump no matter what, and they don't really focus on the progressive white churches. Do you think that's helpful or not helpful?
I think it's very corrosive because there are persons of faith who are actively engaged in these issues. Right here in Washington, D.C., the Mount Vernon Place United Methodist Church was founded as almost a tribute to the Confederacy. The statues, the monuments there all celebrate the Confederacy. But yet the pastor there spoke today at the King Monument and declared that that congregation has been on a multi-year process of naming racism, claiming their complicity with white privilege, and so it is important not to allow the media to paint with a broad brush Christian churches.
I spoke to Reverend Vernon Tyson, who was the former chaplain of the State Assembly of North Carolina. And he said that in the 1830s, when the churches split, Southern Methodist and Methodist, Southern Baptist and Baptist, over slavery, that the war was inevitable because if the people of faith couldn't get it together on slavery, then the country as a whole was not going to.
That's why today's event was both historic, but yet absolutely vital. 38 member communions, which they have persons in some of their congregations that still are insensitive to the issues of racial justice, but the leadership has come together. Listen, I've been a part of the ecumenical movement now for 40 years, and I have heard persons of good conscience condemn racism. But we have never had a public witness as powerful as today where the leadership of churches, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodists, and a broad range of Christians from across this country to publicly confess, repent, and acknowledge their complicity with white privilege. That in and of itself is important so that we begin to shift the narrative from being defined by the Robert Jeffries and the others who don't represent the cause of Christ.
I'll give you just a little context of what Reverend Barber was talking about that day. And this was in the church where James Reeb used to preach. James Reeb was also murdered during the Civil Rights Movement, and countless other foot soldiers were also murdered. And then you also have people who just were terrorized with violence. Their houses were burned down. Their churches were bombed. They were beaten up. Many of those people I know didn't continue to participate at the same level that they had before. So I think what he's saying is that the civil rights movement was murdered in many ways. Martin Luther King is one emblem.
Yes, and drive-by shootings, they're not wearing hoods anymore, but people who ride by houses and shoot into houses, yes, those things happen. But the civil rights movement is manifesting itself in a new way. You have a new generation of activists who are out on the street. You have children, middle school, elementary school children who are out on the street. This represents a new generation of activists who are speaking up and standing up.
There is a deep-seated hope in my spirit. It is not a naive optimism, but it is a hope rooted both in history as well as my faith that says, and every time there was a crushing setback, that there was also a comeback. And we are seeing young people rise up. Trayvon Martin was for this generation what Emmett Till was for my generation. And the young people are going to rise up and are rising up and have gained their voice and vision. And they will be the ones that lead us in this new reconstruction.
I have read that so many of the people who decided to get on a Freedom Ride bus were the same age that Emmett Till was when Emmett Till was murdered.
The civil rights movement was a part of stream of consciousness that was led in the abolitionist movement, the Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass. And so the civil rights movement was caught up in that stream of consciousness. And while some of the strategies and philosophies of the contemporary movement may not be identical to the civil rights movement, it is that stream of consciousness, of justice that they have inherited and are taking on to this next generation. So I am very hopeful about what my grandson will find 50 years from now.
Thank you very much for your time.